Hey, everybody, this is Dan with Pain Free You. Today, I have the pleasure of speaking with Rita La Barbera from New Jersey, actually, and we were pretty close to each other. I grew up in New Jersey, so we were kind of neighbors. We're still kind of neighbors because I'm just down in Bucks County, PA, near New Hope. So, pleasure to meet you. I know I've seen your name online in comments and all sorts of things over the years. So, it's a pleasure to actually meet you. And Rita was gracious enough to share her success with us here. So, Rita, welcome. Why don't you introduce yourself and, if you will, tell us a little story? It's story time.
Thank you. I'm so happy to be here, Dan. I've been a faithful viewer since the inception of your channel. I just want you to know that.
Been watching
And
a while. That's
I,
great.
yeah, yep. And I think your stellar library here, it's such a blessing to this community. It really is. And I wanted to thank you for your recent videos highlighting the CRPS label as well, because as you know, it can be such a pessimistic and unnecessarily dire sounding one. And this group of sufferers does tend to be more highly medicalized and more noceboed. And so, just to preface my personal story, I'd like to reassure anybody who's watching right now or who might be suffering or whose loved one may be suffering that this situation is actually totally benign and temporary and reversible. So, yes. So my experience with the the CRPS label, which was actually called RSD back then, was preceded by other forms of mind body, other manifestations of TMS throughout my life. Most notably, after I got married, I had interstitial cystitis, which is sort of it's a painful bladder syndrome, and that went on for full force for almost a year. And I didn't have Dr. Sarno on my radar at the time. And so fortunately, it resolved on its own. I think my brain got diverted because I was in the process of moving. And, I think that the limit, the setting in my brain, the alarm hadn't reached its limit yet. And so it just kind of resolved. And these things often do resolve on their own, Um, so after, so fast forward a little bit. um, After I had my older son, my first child, I had a very traumatic childbirth, a very traumatic delivery, I should say, and that resulted in I had to have a sort of like reconstructive surgery on my bladder. But fortunately, I must say I've never had a single bladder symptom since that surgery, and I didn't have it before either. So I just wanted to make a note of that because I think it's important. So fast forward again, after my younger son was born, he was diagnosed with autism. And I found myself on this devastating trajectory of unremitting stress and hypervigilance. And things just went from bad to worse. My son, he lost all of his words, and he regressed. It was like watching your child get kidnapped slowly in front of you. That's what it felt like.
Yeah,
And
my sister has an autistic boy who's now
he did.
18, and I got to watch firsthand
Yeah.
how devastating, challenging, and all-consuming my sister and her husband's life became in caring for and trying to optimize this child's development. So I can certainly understand what you went through. Not completely, but at least from a
Yes.
external watching it happen.
Absolutely, absolutely. Yes, you have a good idea Um, and so my son also has many additional medical problems, and at the time he was also tantruming nonstop, and he would have these night wakings throughout the night. Um, and so for years, I felt as if I was being held hostage by the autism. And it really took a toll on my nervous system. And in order to survive and hyper cope, really, I had to repress a lot of very ugly and unacceptable emotions that were not aligned with my self-image as a good person, as a loving mom. And I recently came across a study on moms of autistic children, and they were comparing these moms with actual combat veterans in terms of levels of PTSD and stress. And I thought that was really interesting.
Well, because it can feel like combat
It,
sometimes.
it really did. I felt like I was in the trenches of a battleground every single day. I really did. Um, so fast forward, when my son was 5 years old, we had a very traumatic event. He stopped breathing, and he almost died, and he had to be airlifted
Wow.
to intensive care. And there was a whole scene in the ER with like a priest and a rabbi and people praying and nurses scurrying around. And
Wow.
so that was quite a capital T trauma, you could say. And around that time, this is still before the CRPS label, I started developing mysterious leg pain in both legs. And this went on for about a year and a half. And I just bounced around to different practitioners and physical therapists. And I was at my wit's end. I was taking about 8 tramadols a day at one point. And it was really really out of control. And of course, they weren't helping me either.
Right.
And so, luckily, though, I suddenly remembered that I had been a big fan of Howard Stern since I was 14 years old. And I remembered that he had written a book where he dedicated the book to this doctor. I couldn't remember it. So I ordered Howard's book first, and I saw in the dedication dedicated to Dr. John E. Sarno. And I'm like, okay, that's it. So I ordered Healing Back Pain.
Yep.
And that was the day that came in the mail. I still remember it. I still remember pulling it out of the mailbox, and I literally inhaled that book because it was the closest thing I could compare to a spiritual awakening. Because when things don't make sense and you feel lost and confused, you feel spiritually dead, So this was sort of an epiphany for me. It was a revelation, and especially the parts about the personality traits. I mean, I kept looking for my picture in the pages. I'm like, where am I?
Right.
And so it was after 4 months, I was one of those book cure people. I got completely better just from obtaining the knowledge. But as it not often, but as it sometimes happens, I still had some more work to do, as Dr. Sarno would say, and I had to go a little bit deeper because a few months after I was better, my brain created another diversion, if you will. So this time it upped the ante, and now I'm heading into the CRPS story. So I was, I was walking with my family one day, and I noticed that my sandal felt tight. And it was weird because they were old, comfortable sandals. And I thought I sprained my big toe, my right toe. And so I went to the podiatrist, and she gave me a cortisone injection. And instead of getting better, the pain spread through the whole right foot. And then it did this mirror image to the left foot. And so right there, you can see the brain involvement right there. And so over time, this spread to the knees and eventually full body. And so, when it comes to symptoms, if the body has the functionality to do something, the brain can co-opt it. So it can literally do anything. So in my case, I had all of the neuropathic kind of agonizing, stabbing and burning type of pains. And I had a lot of sensory distortions and sensory sensations, such as allodynia and hyperalgesia, and the feeling of my bones and my feet being broken, and the feeling of like a cotton sheet would feel like knives, or a light breeze would make me want to pass out,
But
Um,
I appreciate that experience. I'm just going to ask a little bit that you tone down the
okay, I don't want to trigger anyone.
scary language. And so for anybody listening, bear with us. It's going to get better.
Yes, yes.
Her experience is not your experience.
Yeah, I
Um,
promise you. Yeah.
and I understand that. And I appreciate the fact that it was that wild.
The
And
reason, yeah, the reason I bring this up is not to regale people my symptoms, because I actually rarely talk about symptoms, but there's often a lot of skepticism as to, did she really have CRPS in the CRPS community? So I just, I need
I'm
to
just
be,
trying to find that balance. I hope you
yes,
understand.
I understand. I'm sorry. Yes, I
Don't
completely.
apologize. Don't apologize. I just want to reel it in a little bit. And because I do know that I've had in the past somebody, leave a comment. I had to stop watching. I was too triggered.
Okay, I know.
So I'm just,
But
for everybody's sake.
the only thing more contagious than germs are ideas, right? So
Here.
we actually have control over that. But so, after a while, I even had some visual changes, because your brain will alter your physiology. And so I did have, swelling and redness and temperature changes and color changes. And then, of course, my mobility was also affected. And so, of course, I went down many rabbit holes with in the medical mill. After the podiatrist, I saw an orthopedist, and he gave me a boot, which makes no sense. Why would you encase your foot in a boot? But anyway, then I went to this complete quack who diagnosed me with Lyme disease, and I was taking copious amounts of antibiotics for months, because I tested positive on some crazy lab,
Some enzyme somewhere. Yeah.
right. And then I went to 5 different rheumatologists, and I was misdiagnosed with rheumatoid arthritis. And then finally, I was referred out to neurologists, and it took me 6 months just to get the CRPS label, which is, of course, is just a label.
Right.
And I have to say that descent into the medical mill was really emotionally taxing. So I told you about the physical stuff, but just emotionally, every encounter I had with a practitioner resulted in some kind of mini attachment trauma. They would either abandon me or dismiss me or ghost me or refer me out. And that was really upsetting. And so out of my desperation, I I tried a lot of treatments in both the medical and the alternative world industries. So I tried drugs and nerve blocks and Calmari therapy. And I flew to Italy to have bisphosphonate infusions. And at its worst, I had high protocol, high dose ketamine infusions, which was really unpleasant in itself. And
Right.
so that was not fun. So yeah.
Flying around the world looking for a solution.
Yeah, I mean, I went down the mill for sure. And so the depths of, my hell, if you will, culminated in the summer of 2014. And at this point, I was bedridden. I could barely walk. I could barely get to the bathroom. I had to use a wheelchair. And it was really, what they call the dark night of the soul, if you will. And so luckily, though, I called Dr. Schubner, Dr. Howard Schubner, and he was kind enough to return my call. And I asked him, I said, I can't find very much about this label because it was called RSD. I can't find very much on RSD,
What does that mean?
reflex sympathetic dystrophy.
Okay.
The old, there were different names for this. During the Civil War, they called it causalgia. They would see this a lot with soldiers who had amputations and they still had phantom limb. And so um,
Okay.
that's where the history is. It was first discovered there. So he said to me, well, the genesis is still the brain. It's still TMS. So even though it's a little bit more dramatic, a little bit more colorful, it's still TMS. So really, my brain had just become more sensitized because of fear and confusion. And so after speaking to Dr. Schubner for literally all of 2 minutes, I knew I was going to turn the battleship around. I knew I was going to get better. I knew there was nothing wrong with me. I basically, the symptoms lost all their power, and I automatically felt safe in a sense. And so I saw the symptoms for what they were, which were just false alarms. And the truth of the matter is that all chronic pain is phantom pain, if you think about it. And so the symptoms didn't terrorize me anymore, intimidate me. And over time, what happens is your fear dials down, and the symptoms dissipate as a happy natural consequence of that. So you don't even have to do anything. It's a byproduct of doing the work. So out of my struggle, if you will, emerged a framework of how I got better.
Great. Great. I'd love to hear about that. And by
Okay.
the way, Howard Stern is how I found out about Dr. Sarno.
Oh, did you really?
I heard him speaking about Sarno on the radio one day as I was driving to work,
That's
feeling
funny.
awful. So
Yeah. Yeah. Who knows how many people Howard helped?
wonderful.
He was such,
Love him or hate him, he spread the word.
and he's a smart guy. He is an intelligent person, love him or hate him. so, so I was, yeah, I was very grateful to Howard as well. But yes, it was in terms of, how the sausage was made, as they say. So of course we have the first pillar, which is the knowledge, obtaining knowledge and clarity. And as Dr. Sarno said, knowledge is the penicillin, right? So I set about to do some bibliotherapy. I read some books, and at the time I joined the TMS wiki, which I think it was the only main resource back then. And I was very fortunate because it was my lifeline at that time. And there were wonderful OG members who encouraged me. People like shout out to, uh, Walt and Herbie and Forrest and Steve Ozanich and Collie and many, many others that I just want to thank them for their help because they were so invaluable to me. And so then, of course, we have the second pillar, which is implementation, right? So for me, just like for you, Dan, it was a lot. It was a heuristic process. There was a lot of trial and error. And, typically we think of implementation when we think of action steps. In this case, it's really on the level of thought. Most of the action is on the level of thought.
Mhm.
So our thoughts truly do determine our physiology. And what might have began as sort of a distraction for underlying emotional processes quickly turns into a habit of the way the brain and body interact, and it becomes entrenched by our thinking, right? So, Dr. Sarno always said, resume all normal physical activity. But before I could even do that, I had to resume all normal mental activity because my thinking really wasn't where it should be. And I had to start there, to be honest. And so I had to become aware of my negative thought habits and the negative self-talk and some of my tendencies to project into the future and catastrophize or to regret the past and beat myself up. And all these kinds of thought habits were creating, they were generating continuous inner tension, And so I had to learn to start nipping them in the bud and installing new and accurate thoughts. And, just as we practice, in a sense, we practice and memorize our symptoms and suffering, we can reverse that. And so the analogy I like is like the piano analogy, because I'm no Vladimir Horowitz or anything, but if you give me some sheet music and I practice it enough times, it's very annoying and tedious in the beginning, but it is doable and it does become effortless. So a book that really helped me with this at that time was by Joe Dispenza. It's called Breaking the Habit of Being Yourself. And I found that very helpful.
Okay.
That thought piece, if you will. And so the next thing I had to set about doing was, ditching the doubts or banishing the doubts. And really, doubt encompasses any form of not knowing. And doubt, the emotional form of doubt, is fear, and fear is the fuel for symptoms. So I sort of had to become a doubt ninja. And I had a lot of doubts about my body and my capabilities. And I had doubts about myself. And I also had doubts about the RSD label, because on the wiki at the time, nobody else had that label at that time. This was like 2013 or something. And so I had to counter those doubts with logic and accurate knowledge. And it's not a matter of blind faith, it's a matter of proof. And so I had to sort of become my own inner coach. I kept an evidence sheet, and I had affirmations for myself, and I had a mantra. I made a lot of this stuff up. I mean, I just invented it at the time, but my favorite mantra was shift. So every time I would, have a doubt thought or get distracted by symptoms, I would shift from the physical to the psychological, because Dr. Sarno always said that. So whatever he said, I used as as a mantra, basically. And so the next thing was, this is a subset of doubt, is triggers. So triggers are any external, any innocuous stimuli from the external world that, my brain had gotten into the habit of interpreting as dangerous, even though they were harmless. And so of course, that leads, it leads people into an avoidance cycle, which was happening with me. I was starting to avoid things. And so my triggers were very common ones, like walking or movement or positions. But I also had triggers such as different, like, shoes or sneakers, because all I could wear were these giant Crocs. So I would get very triggered by, like, even if I went to TJ Maxx and I saw the shoe department, I would get really triggered. And things like fabrics or temperature. So those were my triggers. And I had to start disarming and neutralizing those triggers. And so how did I do that? Well, I had to tolerate a little bit of fear, and I had to gradually, incrementally re-engage in those activities without putting any pressure on myself. So that was key. I did it very slowly, and I didn't, I took my time. So, and the next area I worked on was dismantling, this was crucial for me, dismantling my false beliefs. So my false beliefs had originated from these old programs and conditioning. And one of my favorite quotes is by Carl Jung. It goes, "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate." And so a lot of our false beliefs come from society, things like the media or the medical industry, or our education, our family, our upbringing, our religion, or things like that. But most of my false beliefs came from my own inner dialogue and my own mental inventories. And you see, a belief is just a thought that you've thought a million times, and it becomes kind of ingrained, and it becomes a belief. And so I had to disabuse myself of my own beliefs and put them into question, hold them up to scrutiny. And so what happened was my false beliefs had to shift to deep knowings, if you will. So that was a big one for me, because these false beliefs had formed sort of a mental prison in a sense. The next thing I did was I had to dispense with the tyranny of the should. And TMS also stands for too much shoulding, right? So I had this shouldy approach to life, and it did partly stem from the social imperative, but mostly it stemmed from my own inner tyrant. And I think that the biggest stress on earth is trying to be who you're not. And I had to stop bullying myself. I had to liberate myself from the demands of this inner taskmaster. And I had to free myself from this self-imposed prison. And so I had to replace the word should or ought or must with the word want. What do I want? So that was a big thing for me. The next thing was this idea of outcome independence. At the time, Alan Gordon had written an article on the Wiki about this concept, and it's kind of a Buddhist idea of, it's a philosophy of being process oriented and not attached to results. And so, because I knew that I was on the right path, luckily I really didn't care how long it was going to take me. So I took satisfaction in the fact that I was on the right path, and any little win I had, I would, celebrate, I guess you'd say. And I didn't put a timetable or calendar watch or have a sense of urgency, because those can be pitfalls. And often the faster we want to get better, the longer it will take, So I think that it's important not to get into what they call competitive healing. And really, success is measured by how little you care, really. And so
A lot of common themes with many of the concepts I teach in my videos and coaching.
Oh, yes, for sure. The way you got better, Dan, was so validating, because your videos just confirmed how I got better. When I started watching you, I was already better, but I was like, take it to the church.
What we realize when we kind of get through this is we didn't do anything really special. What we did was we had to stumble, trial and error, and find the universal principles of getting better.
Right.
On our own. And fortunately, the folks these days have all sorts of people sharing what's going on, not just me, but like countless other people online. And they're
Yeah,
all dropping these little truth bombs of here's how you get better, how you get better, how you get better. And, it's trial and error and integrating it into our own life and into our own recovery process. So, yeah, I mean, I didn't make any of this stuff up. It's just
yeah,
figure it out as you go and find different ways of explaining it. And so, yeah, that's good stuff. Competitive healing. I hadn't heard that term, but yeah, it's comparison to others. Somebody got better in 3 months and I'm at 5 months. How come I'm not better yet?
exactly. And don't compete with yourself either.
Yeah.
Because sometimes we have these inner metrics of, once again with the shoulding or, you know, so, or because I had the book cure the first time, why is this taking longer, But there's reasons for that. And you just have to be okay with it. And so I think tied into this concept of outcome independence is the mindset of indifference, which I know, is one of your main tenets, Dan. And I think that of course, indifference is the silver bullet in terms of it's the most effective way to teach the brain that there's no danger. But you have to start somewhere. So my response to symptoms had to become one of not worried, unconcerned, no big deal, whatever. And I sort of had to get bored with them. And, I had this extra layer of preoccupation with the visuals behind which the defense was hiding. And so even there, same thing, I had to not get tricked by the visuals and not be so impressed with them. I mean, who cares? It's temporary. It's going to go back to normal. Why be so impressed by it?
But,
So
but I will say the visual disturbances, um, I noticed there's a ton of fear surrounding it. Because
yes.
people are like, it's not in the book. How come,
Yes. And you're like, well, I can see it. So it's hard to wrap your head around the fact that you're not experiencing it in the body tissue or in the limb or, it's in the brain that you're
right.
perceiving it. And so, sure, I mean, think about if you're sad and you cry tears, there's something you can see. You can see the tears. If I get embarrassed and I blush, I don't go to the cheek doctor because I'm blushing. It's just a physiological transient alteration. It's not a big deal. So you have to look at it that way. So the next area I worked on, and this is where I had to go this time, was the emotional discovery piece. Um, so I did have therapy. And therapy gave me a safe place and helped me to get out of repression mode. And it helped me to contend and grapple with a lot of these disavowed emotions that had been relegated to my unconscious that were festering for a long time. And most of all, therapy relieved me of the inner conflict I had about having those emotions, because emotions are safe. It's the feelings we have about them. It's the judgment we have about the emotions that creates the tension and the conflict. And so, for example, I had a lot of rage and resentment, and I had tremendous guilt underlying that rage. And so I had to reconcile that and give myself permission and realize that it doesn't make me a bad person just because I have those emotions. And I remember one time my therapist asked me, when do you feel safe? And I was so taken aback by that question because I had never thought about it in my whole life. And I realized I never felt safe because I was always at war with myself. I was living in a schism, and you can't feel safe when you're being hard on yourself all day long. It's really hard to feel safe. So that was sort of that was a revelation also.
Yeah.
Um,
self-criticism is always perceived as dangerous. And
Absolutely.
danger is perceived as fear, and fear is what really drives symptoms because the perception of danger um, is really why these false alarms are going off everywhere.
Exactly, exactly. And, tied to that were my, adjacent to that were my personality traits that were some of the aspects of my personality were actually hurting me. And, from the time I was little, I had this drive to be good. And Sarno coined this term goodism, which is sort of a moral form of perfectionism. And for me, it presented as always wanting approval from my parents and from teachers, from authority figures, conforming to expectations, being highly self-critical, um, being hard on myself, worrying a lot. Also, I was also very conflict avoidant. So
Was that early in life or more later in life, like after your son was born? And
I think my personality began very early on. It manifest since the time I was little. I was sort of like a good girl. I wanted my teachers to like me. I wanted to get good grades. I wanted to strive academically. I wanted my parents to be proud of me. So I think it started very early on. I worried a lot about other kids' feelings and not hurting people's feelings. And the teachers would always pair me like if there was somebody being bullied and there was some kind of class project or play, they would always pair me up with the outcast kid because they knew I wasn't going to be mean to them. So I think it started very young. So I think all of that, though, it does create an internal pressure cooker. And I think my existence sort of became a projection of others' wishes and who I thought I was supposed to be. And so, the interesting thing about TMS, and I've noticed this across the board, um, it's the only psychological defense out of all the hundreds of defenses that protects not only you, but it protects other people. So in a sense, it's only the really nicest, loveliest people who employ this defense. And so in a way, you should be proud of, if this is your defense of choice, be proud of it because it's actually a nice one, although you do have to change, but it still says something about you, that you're a good person. So I think that's something to think about,
because we recently had a conversation. Somebody asked in the group, it was like, how come I got it and other people don't? And you may have just answered that question that
That's why.
you're a nice person and you're doing everything to protect not just yourself, but the others around you. And
Yes, it's a very highly evolved.
creating.
Yeah, yeah, it does produce. Yeah, it's a very highly evolved, sophisticated defense, um, and it does reflect well on the individual. You never see this with sociopaths. Like you'll never see a sociopath with chronic back pain, So but yes, and I think that my symptoms were also operating as a communication. They were an objection to my own self-betrayal. And I think for a long time I was hiding my own wants and desires from myself. And so the symptoms were sort of a messenger to help me realize that I also have a right to my life, and that adage of, to thine own self be true. And so really, I think symptoms are you telling you about yourself ultimately. Um, and so that leads me to another thing I had to do, which was I had to improve my relationship with myself. And so one way to measure progress is to see if your fear is reducing, right? But another way to measure progress is your relationship with yourself improving? Because if you start to like yourself more and you start to appreciate yourself more, and you're not as mean to yourself, and your relationship isn't as toxic with yourself, that means you're making progress. And so I was kind of mean to myself. So I had to develop, more self-acceptance and self-compassion and like myself a little more. And I had to start living more in alignment.
Yeah.
And
Was
yeah.
there ever a time when you blamed yourself for your symptoms?
Um,
Like, I did this to myself type
hmm.
of thing? Because I see that quite often. People are like, well, if it's my brain, I did this to myself. And then they double down on the self-critical thoughts and behaviors.
No, I didn't. Luckily I didn't. I didn't blame myself, but I have heard people say that, and that's a whole other level of self-flagellation, because now that's a secondary level of bullying yourself, and that's self-abuse. It's not your fault that you have the symptoms, but you are the solution, and that's the good news. And it's nobody's fault. It's not an intentional thing. It's it's your brain's way of protecting you, and it's nobody's fault. And so it's important to know that. I think I did feel that my body had betrayed me, though. I felt that why has my body forsaken me? So there was this feeling of um, that I couldn't trust my body. But I got over that when I improved my relationship with myself. I no longer saw my body as unsafe or some kind of encumbrance. I saw it as being on my side. My body and my brain are on my side. They're they're empathizing with me. They're my best friends. And so I had to change my relationship with my body as well. And, I think I had to make some practical changes in my life to make my life work for me a bit more. Not everybody has to do this, but I did. I had to learn how to set boundaries and let little things go more. And I had to start pursuing more fun and more joy and more connection with people. And I think some things that are very underrated are things like creative expression, whether it's, hobbies or things that excite you, things like music or poetry or songwriting or making jewelry or cooking or home decor or painting or whatever, some kind of creative outlet. It's really important. And I think having a sense of humor is really important. And I also think being of service to others. I think Dr. Sarno, one of his tenets was that to expedite healing, that you help other people. And when you do that, you're actually helping yourself as well. And I'm sure you see that a lot in your group, Stan, where people help others.
There's a
So
lot of community support
yeah,
in the group coaching calls as well as the private community Facebook.
yeah,
People always cheering each other on and helping each other out. And if somebody asks a question in the group and I give an answer, somebody will go, hey, can I talk to so and so? I had that same thing and I'm past it. I've gotten better from that. I still have some other things I'm working on, but I got better. And it's so supportive. Uh,
yeah,
and just even the fact that you're doing this success story and I've got well over 50 at this point. It's just amazing how many people come out and go, "Hey Dan, would you be open to me doing a success story?" They're volunteering for
yeah.
this. I'm not I'm not pursuing them. So
Oh, that's such a great sign. It just goes to show you. And there's so many people who we never hear about that get better. You have to realize that as well. Thousands of people get better. They just go on with their lives because, maybe they don't want to revisit it, or they just, not everybody is compelled to, you know. So yeah, so those were the main areas that I worked on. That's how I got better in a nutshell. That's how I got better. So
only those 32 things.
10. It was like 10. But there
It's
was a lot of
great.
overlap, right? There was a lot of overlap.
If you were to look at all of it, you created safety in your life.
Yes.
Because the doubt, the fear, the overwhelm, the self-judgment, the self-critical behaviors and thoughts, all created this whole, cloud of danger.
Yes.
And all of those things that you walked through really were geared towards one thing. I'm actually okay. I got to teach my brain that. And
Yes.
maybe it was these 10 things that you really, um, in hindsight, looked back and says, oh, those were all the things I did. And that's how you created kind of like your framework of what worked for you.
Right.
But at the end of the day, you resolved the fear and the danger with all of these various things. And that created the safety, which calmed the brain and the whole system.
Right.
So that's beautiful. That's awesome.
Yeah. And I really think that the whole odyssey was happening for me to not only liberate me from that prison of fear and danger, but also to help me evolve and grow spiritually and to expand my consciousness, so I can look back on that now with more clarity. But yes, I think that I read a quote once. The only thing wrong with me was the belief that there was something wrong with me.
And I always say, you're not broken, you just think you are.
Exactly, exactly. And so, yeah, and I mean, I have a few little tips or general advice I can
Please.
impart if
Oh, I
you'd like.
love it.
Okay.
I love it.
So yes, I just wanted to leave your audience with a few tips. So the first thing is, don't buy into rubbish labels. These diagnostic labels, they're just fancy ways of saying anxiety, and we have to depathologize them. We live in this age of labelism and groupthink, and Dr. Sarno had flipped the medical paradigm on its head decades ago. But these sad diagnostic labels and the fallacies and the dogma and the mythology and the outdated clinical care persist, not because of the past 30 years of neuroscience research, but despite it. And so it's really, it's quite scandalous if you think about it. But the paradigm is slowly starting to catch up to Dr. Sarno. And I think, these labels can also be a form of medical hexing. And so when we accept a label, we're basically limiting ourselves into nothing but a thought. and don't do that, because we're limitless beings. So why should you buy into that,
Yeah, I tell people all the time to drop the labels. They're not benefiting you in any way. And people will be like, yeah, but my symptoms match the medical label. I'm like, yeah, that's because they looked at the symptom and came up with a name for it.
Exactly.
It's not a new disease. It's a medical label to describe a set of symptoms.
They conflate the symptoms with the cause. And, they victimize and enslave people, and they imply permanence. They imply that there's some kind of permanence, which is
because so much in the medical library out there is, here's what's going on. We don't know what causes it, and there is no cure. And people just say they accept it. And I'm saying anytime they don't know what causes it and there is no cure, it's most likely TMS, perceived danger symptoms.
absolutely. Or if there's a word like syndrome or disorder, those are clues as well.
Yep, sure.
And I think just know that no matter what diagnostic label was bestowed on you, the mind body approach works for all of the labels and for every single person. And so in the CRPS world, I should just debunk a few little pieces of verbiage that they bandy about a lot, which are these words of window, remission, and spreading. So this idea that there's a window and you have to like catch it in time is an absolute lie. It doesn't matter if you've had symptoms for 20 years. You could get better overnight on a dime if you change your mindset. So that's just nonsense. The other term they use, sometimes you'll come across this, is remission. That's not an apt term. This is not cancer. It's not a pathology like cancer that can go into remission and then come back. Once you know something, you can't unknow it. So throw that out. And this idea of spreading, this isn't peanut butter or poison ivy, okay? So the only thing that was spreading for me were my fears and my negative mindset. That's what was expanding. The symptoms aren't spreading. So yeah, symptoms are not peanut butter. They don't spread. That's such a misnomer.
Yeah, I mean, I think I just did a meme recently about if symptoms are multiplying, your fear and attention is likely multiplying as well.
Absolutely. Oh, yes, I saw that. Yes, you're absolutely right. I saw that. Yeah. Yes. This morning
But
you had a video as well that applied to what I'm about to say, I think. But we're on the same wavelength.
yeah,
Yeah, and so the other tip I have is avoid fear-mongering media. And so really, the media does such an immense disservice to the public. They dash hope. They lead people to believe in lies. And so when you Google a label like CRPS, for example, invariably your algorithm will be plastered with all of these clickbaity, sensationalistic, hyperbolic thumbnails. Don't click onto them. Just don't go there. Also, don't go on label message boards or support groups. They're very toxic. They are scary neighborhoods, as you say, Dan.
all bad
And
neighborhoods for sure.
yeah, and it's like being in like crabs in a bucket. As soon as one person says, "Well, I heard about this stuff," they're like, "No, no, no." They'll all like drag you down. So just avoid those like the plague.
I have a question for you. I don't know the classification of drug tramadol is, but is that a benzo?
It's a semi-opiate. It's also called Ultram.
Okay.
So it
So
can be addicting.
did you have many challenges as far as either being on the meds or coming off of them? Because I know in this world, in my world where I operate, it's a ton of people that are terrified by the concept of benzo withdrawals. And there's a lot of bad neighborhoods in that world
Yes, yes.
speaking about, permanent injury and damage and GABA receptors and all this stuff.
That's more fear mongering,
Right?
more mythology, and it's completely erroneous. Don't buy into that either. I was on. I mean, I wasn't just on Ultram. At one point, I was on Ultram, and my body started to repel it. I started vomiting. I couldn't keep my body. My body rejected them, so I stopped that. But through my CRPS journey, I was taking benzo. I was taking to sleep, and there's no shame in that. I needed something to help me sleep. And I took that, and I was taking very high doses of an antidepressant, and what else? And I had those ketamine infusions. But I will say that it was super easy to get off. There was no withdrawal. I didn't have to, it wasn't a big drama. It was just as I felt calmer and safer, and as the fear went down and my thoughts changed, I didn't need those things anymore.
But you were already partly through this journey when you started coming off of the medications, correct?
Yeah, yeah. So when Dr. Schubner told me it was just my brain, at that point, I kind of started, I think that was the turning point for me. It was a watershed moment where I started lowering everything. I didn't really feel the need for it anymore.
Yeah, because for some people, um, the medications, the effects and the side effects of coming off are part of their original journey. And they dive into those bad neighborhoods and become absolutely terrified. And years later, they're still talking about, you know, injury and damage and, you know,
Yeah.
all sorts of stuff. And it's really hard to unwind that once you get into that level of terror that your brain's been injured by the medication. But yet, here's a perfect example of you that you were on the same medications. And because there wasn't the fear,
Yeah.
you didn't have the complications.
And
And I
also,
truly believe, and I'm not saying medications can't cause effects, they can. Coming off of them can cause effects. But when you add being terrified on top of that, things don't go well. And the way to get out of that is to dial down the terror and the fear and trust your body and your brain. I remember Dr. Schubner said something along the lines in his own forum on his website that it's a good idea to taper, but don't taper so slowly that it creates more fear.
yes,
Trust your body and brain to adjust, and it will. And it's
yes.
your job to remind yourself that you're going to be okay. So he didn't get into the whole, well, GABA receptors and damage.
Well, I think a lot of that nonsense gets propagated by the alternative industry, by like I think the alternative, the mainstream medical has its own wrongdoings, you could say, but the alternative is particularly fear mongering and predatory. They're not covered by insurance usually. The treatments are it's a lot of pseudoscience. And so if somebody in that world told you that, I would not give it one bit of credence whatsoever.
And those are the same types of folks who probably dragged you into the Lyme recovery
They
world.
are, yes, and they talk a lot about things like mold and toxic mold and
Mhm.
multiple chemical sensitivities and long COVID and vaccines and any flavor du jour of the fear, they'll profit from that. I mean, it's financially driven, and my advice is really stay far away from those types of practices, and also ones that sell supplements and diets, and that's
You go
just
into the doctors, you come home with $600 worth of supplements.
yeah. Yeah, or they tell you have viruses, Epstein-Barr. Like if I took my blood, it shows very high levels of Epstein-Barr because as a child I had this it's like a herpes lesion and it's somehow related to Epstein-Barr and um but I mean, I'm fine. I don't have symptoms from it, you know. So I think they propagate a lot of misinformation, a lot of faulty diagnoses, and so
Epstein, isn't Epstein-Barr actually mono?
yeah,
Leosis? Is that different?
somehow under that umbrella of Epstein-Barr. So also be aware that blood tests are very you know, depending on how they're interpreted and who the lab that where it's
Yeah.
done, and you can't go by that.
Yeah.
And people get very hung up on, you know, I have high vitamin B level. They get into all these, they get wrapped up in
I'm iron deficient, and is that why I've got these 18 symptoms? And I'm like,
there's no
oh.
causal relationship whatsoever.
Yeah. And so I tell people we don't really want to try to cure ourselves under a laboratory microscope because I believe in the inherent brilliance of the brain and the body and its
Yeah.
ability to deal with so many things. We've got a beautiful immune system, detoxification system, and
Yeah.
that's evidenced by the fact that there could be a 300, 400-pound person who lives to be 80 years old. It just
Yeah.
means that despite all the toxins that they're eating and drinking and exposing to, the body has this brilliance that keeps us alive. The brain and body's job is survival. And so to think that I'm a little bit deficient on this one element and that's causing 15 symptoms, no.
No, it's really silly in the face of evolution, and the body and brain have an innate capacity,
Wisdom.
all conscious awareness. You don't even have to micromanage or look at it. It goes back to homeostasis. If you cut yourself, it doesn't matter if you're watching cartoons for the next 2 weeks or you're staring at it, it's going to heal, right? So you have to get out of your own way in that sense. And I think people get better all the time, but their voices get drowned out by all the din, all of this, white noise. And I think that really what you should be, in terms of media, watch Dan's success stories. Go to the thankyoudrsarno.org site if you want to see real people who got better. The media always presents the negative because that's what sells. And they're also 75% of the media is subsidized by big pharma. That's a fun fact. So
fun, but true.
So it's or not so fun fact. So you can there you go. That explains everything. So and I think another thing that I learned as a autism mom is because there's no one more desperate than a parent trying to help their child. And so because of my desperation, I rushed into a lot of things and I made a lot of decisions that I later regretted and used poor judgment, and I wasted, resources and time and probably traumatized my poor son. I did a lot of things that I regret. And so with the mind body, in the mind body world, I have the same piece of advice. Take your time. There's no rush. Don't get sidetracked by tools and interventions and gimmicky programs that rely heavily on marketing. Those are sideshows. Concentrate on the centerpiece of recovery, which is the knowledge. And, I think for people who have obsessive tendencies, the tools and the programs can be especially problematic. So my advice is, take your time. There's no rush whatsoever. And then if you want to take a psychoeducational class or join Dan's group, or maybe eventually have some one-on-one coaching, you can always do that. But there's no reason to sign up for 1 million programs and, start.
Yeah, I've definitely worked with people who jump from one TMS practitioner to another. Basically asking the same questions to as many people as they can get in touch with.
Right.
But never sticking with any of them for very long. So.
Yeah, it becomes sort of, you go on this wild goose chase and you have to really get back to the basics, keep it simple. It's not, I got better and I never, I'll be honest, I never meditated, I never journaled. I didn't, there were no programs. There was no, there's a lot of these like brain limbic, all these science. No, I didn't do any of that. And I really sort of have an aversion to those things as well, because they imply that there's something to fix. And so once again, people who are obsessive get into that fix it mode, right? So
yeah, I don't give homework. I don't tell people, here's your 16-point checklist to do every day. And if you don't do this exactly, you're not going to get better. I don't tell anybody any of that stuff. It's about knowledge. That knowledge helps you dial down the fear. Oh, that was a weird thing that just popped up on the screen. It's some Zoom reaction thing. Let's try it again. That's so funny. It's automatic reactions. I did this animated hand something. And all these balloons started popping up in the middle of my Zoom coaching call. All right, back on track. That was a distraction. I got to figure out how to turn that stuff off.
I like it actually.
It truly is about the knowledge. And once you have that accurate foundation of what's going on, that is a massive tool to reduce the fear. But it's like I have my four foundational, principles that probably not going to get better until you get these four down. What causes symptoms? Perception of danger, fear, right? Perception of danger. Does it apply to me? There are assessments.
Right.
3, is there a cure? Absolutely. And 4, am I capable of implementing it? Now, that's one of the ones that's a little bit more tricky because I hear people saying, but Dan, I've been anxious all my life. I don't know if I'm going to be able to do this. I'm very afraid. I'm terrified of the symptoms. Mm-hmm. And I'm like, well, if anybody else can do it, you can do it too, because many of those people that have gone before you, many of the success stories here on this channel were equally terrified in the beginning. And so don't let your own fears talk you out of implementation, which is truly just acquiring the knowledge, making sure it applies to you. Then after that, it's all about knowledge or a safety therapy. And you've outlined probably, 10 different things that you did, which helped you feel safer socially, emotionally, physically, mentally. I mean, you created safety, and when your brain felt safe enough, but that was on the foundation of accurate knowledge. So that's exactly why you got better.
And there's a saying, like, if 2 people have done something, you can be the third. If one person has done something, you can be the second. If nobody's done it, be the first.
Love that.
So when I was on the wiki, I really didn't have anybody on the wiki. So I was like, all right, I guess I have to be the first.
But a lot of people say, until I find a success story exactly like me, it's not possible. It just doesn't match. It doesn't fit me. But yes, it does.
It's the same for everybody. Sure, we're all idiosyncratic in our little ways. But at the end of the day, TMS is TMS is TMS. Mind body is mind body is mind body. It's all the same. And so I think, another mistake people make is that they do this reassurance seeking, right? And so they externalize by, they're either Googling or they're commiserating with other sufferers or they're complaining to their loved ones. and so when we do that, we take the thought and we make it real. And so my advice is to take total responsibility for your thoughts. There's a quote by William James, believe and your belief will become fact. And so we get to choose our thoughts. We get to choose our beliefs. Yeah. And I think, and I just have one more piece of advice.
Okay. And we could wrap it up soon, but
yeah, it's my last.
Please.
I'll make it quick. So the last one is commit. There's only 2 types of people when it comes to getting better: the willing and the unwilling. And so you have to be willing to commit. Dr. Sarno was willing to go to the mat and stick his neck out every time to champion the truth. And we have to be willing to take that leap of understanding. And there's another quote by Aristotle: we are what we repeatedly do. Excellence, therefore, is not an act, but a habit. And nobody embodies or exemplifies that more than you, Dan. Every single day, without fail, no matter the weather, if you have a cold, if Tractor Boy is making a racket, if something's transpiring in your personal life, you upload a video for 4 years straight. And so
4.5.
4.5. So you personify the attitude that it takes to get better. And there is such a nobility in that. And so just know that if you're watching Dan and you're watching this video, you're on the right path right now. And you just have to stay on it and you just have to keep going.
Yeah. And be willing to go through that trial and error, because there's no perfect formula that I can say, do this exactly tomorrow and you'll be done forever, right? It's not that way. These are lessons we have to learn, habits we have to create, habits of thought, habits of behavior, stop the avoidance tendencies, gradually expand our capacity and start to do more and more so we can gain confidence. Make a note of those wins, right? You've got your evidence sheet that you talked about. These are all very practical, doable things that people can do to keep on taking steps forward each day and keep on making progress. Progress to me is not, are my symptoms gone? No, they're not gone. I'm not making any progress. That's where a lot of people go. Progress is, how's my mindset? Do I have less fear today? Do I see this more clearly today? Am I more confident? Am I willing to stop thinking and talking about my symptoms more? Those are all steps of progress. You know, it's not just, well, and inevitably somebody will be like, well, I was making progress, but boy, my symptoms came back and they came back hard. I'm right where I started. I'm back where I started. And I'm like, no, you can't forget what you did. And if you're doing better before, get the mindset that you had before when you were getting better. Don't launch back into being terrified.
It's just a speed bump. I have this graph, this very technical graph. This is what the process looks like. And it's not linear because your mind is not linear. And so how you respond during this time period where you're waiting for things to happen, it will determine if you accelerate the process or if you delay the process. So this is what it looks like. So expect that.
I've often said, I said, you know, here you go, and you hit a speed bump, and then you hit a speed bump, and then sometimes you go like,
exactly.
Crazy. But that's exactly what your diagram shows. So listen, Rita, I really appreciate you. I understand you also help people out. So would you like to share how people can get in touch?
Sure. So my colleague and friend Tamara Gurin, who you had on your show, she also recovered from CRPS, and she wrote a book called Defying the Verdict, and she created an informational website. We're not selling anything there. It just has links and information and resources, and I contribute blogs there. And you can there's a contact sheet if you want to reach me at defeatcrps.com. You can also defeatcrps.com, and you can email me. I'm happy to help you in any way I can at ritalabarbera@yahoo.com. And you can find me on Facebook, and you can find me on Instagram at Put Pain in the Past.
Put pain in the past. Okay. So it's probably going to take anywhere between a few days to a week or so before this gets edited. My son puts a nice blue frame around it and all that stuff. But keep an eye on the YouTube channel and the Facebook, because there will be people commenting. And if you'd like to interact or respond to the comments, I'm sure they would love that. Anything else you want to share?
No, that's it, Dan. Thank you so much again for having me. It was such a pleasure. And like I said, I'm always happy to help anyone I can. So don't hesitate to contact me. Even if it's not for coaching, I'm really happy to help.
And the same offer goes, if there's ever anything I can do for you, whether it be, you know, this stuff, the coaching side of it, whatever.
Likewise.
Okay. So listen, I really appreciate you, Rita. Great. I mean, I took a lot of notes. You know, you had a lot of good points. So I really appreciate what you shared. For the people watching, go back and watch this one again with a notepad in hand, because there's some gems here. And Rita came through a heck of a story with the CRPS. For some reason, a lot of people don't think CRPS is TMS. And Rita is proof that it is. So I really appreciate you. Thank you for coming on. And I guess we'll talk soon.
Thank you, Dan. Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye.